The parking garage beneath the downtown office complex was dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent bulbs casting eerie shadows between the concrete pillars. Detective Sarah Martinez had just finished a grueling 16-hour shift investigating a series of armed robberies that had been plaguing the city for weeks. Her shoulders ached from hunching over case files, and her eyes burned from staring at surveillance footage for hours on end. She walked slowly toward her silver Honda Civic, her footsteps echoing in the nearly empty garage. It was well past midnight, and most of the building's occupants had long since gone home to their families. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her service weapon, a Glock 19 that had been her constant companion for the past 8 years on the force. The familiar weight of it against her hip provided a sense of security in the isolated parking structure. As she approached her car, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. A white van was parked in the spot next to hers, its engine running despite no driver being visible inside. The vehicle hadn't been there when she had arrived that morning. Her training kicked in immediately, and she felt a surge of adrenaline as her senses sharpened. Years of police work had taught her to trust her instincts, and, right now, every fiber of her being was screaming that something was wrong. Sarah slowed her pace and began to scan the surrounding area more carefully. The garage was too quiet, even for this time of night. She could hear the hum of the van's engine and the distant sound of traffic from the street above, but there was an unnatural stillness that made her skin crawl. Her hand moved closer to her weapon as she continued toward her car, trying to appear casual while remaining alert for any sign of danger. Suddenly, she heard the soft scuff of a shoe against concrete behind her. Sarah spun around, her hand moving instinctively toward her gun, but before she could draw it, she found herself surrounded. 5 men had emerged from behind the concrete pillars like ghosts, moving with a coordinated precision that suggested they had been waiting for her specifically. They weren't random muggers or opportunistic criminals. These men had planned this encounter carefully. The leader of the group was a tall, muscular man with a shaved head and cold, calculating eyes. He wore dark clothing and moved with the confidence of someone who was used to getting what he wanted through intimidation and violence. Behind him, 4 other men spread out in a loose circle, effectively cutting off all potential escape routes. Sarah recognized the tactical formation immediately. These weren't amateurs. "Detective Martinez," the leader said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't immediately place. "We've been waiting for you. You've been getting too close to something that doesn't concern you, and my employer thinks it's time for you to back off." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process the situation. These men knew her name and her profession. They had been watching her, studying her routine, and waiting for the perfect moment to confront her. This wasn't a random attack, it was a message, and possibly something much worse. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to build in her chest. Her hand was still hovering near her weapon, but she hadn't drawn it yet. She needed to assess the situation more carefully before making any sudden movements. The leader smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "The Riverside case, detective. The warehouse fires. The missing evidence. Ring any bells?" Sarah felt her blood run cold. The Riverside case was one of the investigations she had been working on, but it was supposed to be classified information. Someone with access to police files had been feeding information to these men, which meant the corruption she had suspected went deeper than she had imagined. "You're going to stop asking questions," the leader continued. "You're going to lose interest in that particular case, and you're going to find something else to occupy your time. Consider this a friendly warning." "And if I don't?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. The leader's smile widened. "Then, this conversation will be the last one you ever have." The other 4 men began to close in, moving with the same coordinated precision. Sarah realized that they intended to disarm her first, which would leave her completely vulnerable. She had trained for situations like this at the police academy, but facing 5 armed men in a confined space was something that no amount of training could fully prepare someone for. Her hand finally moved to her weapon, but the leader was faster than she had anticipated. He lunged forward with surprising speed, his hand clamping down on her wrist before she could clear her holster. The other men moved in simultaneously, and Sarah found herself in a desperate struggle for control of her gun. The leader was strong, much stronger than she was, but Sarah had advantages that he hadn't counted on. She had been training in martial arts since she was 12 years old, and her years on the police force had taught her how to fight dirty when her life was on the line. She brought her knee up hard into his solar plexus, causing him to grunt and momentarily loosen his grip on her wrist. That moment of hesitation was all Sarah needed. She twisted her arm free and managed to draw her weapon, but before she could bring it to bear on any of her attackers, one of the other men grabbed her from behind. His arm wrapped around her throat in a chokehold while another man seized her gun hand, trying to wrestle the weapon away from her. The garage erupted into chaos as Sarah fought desperately to maintain control of her weapon. She could hear the men shouting at each other in a language she didn't recognize, their coordinated attack beginning to fall apart as she proved to be a more formidable opponent than they had expected. The sound of scuffling feet and heavy breathing echoed off the concrete walls. Sarah managed to break free from the chokehold by driving her elbow back into her attacker's ribs, but the man holding her gun hand was relentless. She could feel her grip on the weapon beginning to slip as he applied pressure to her fingers, trying to force her to release it. Panic began to set in as she realized that once they disarmed her, the situation would become hopeless. With a final, desperate effort, Sarah managed to twist her body around and fire a single shot into the air. The deafening sound of the gunshot echoed through the garage like a thunderclap, and, for a moment, everyone froze. But, instead of scaring off her attackers, the gunshot seemed to make them more determined. The leader cursed and signaled to his men to intensify their attack. 2 more men joined the struggle for her weapon, and, despite her training and determination, Sarah found herself overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Her grip on the gun finally failed, and she watched in horror as her service weapon clattered across the concrete floor and came to rest several feet away, well out of reach. The leader straightened up, breathing heavily from the exertion. "Now we can have a proper conversation," he said, pulling out his own weapon and pointing it at Sarah's head. "You're going to listen very carefully to what I have to say, detective. Your life depends on it." Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands raised slightly in a gesture of apparent surrender. The cold barrel of the leader's gun was pointed directly at her forehead, and she could see his finger resting on the trigger. The other 4 men formed a loose semicircle around her, blocking any possible escape route. Her service weapon lay on the concrete floor like a fallen soldier, its metal surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. But Sarah's apparent submission was a carefully calculated deception. During her years on the police force, she had learned that sometimes the best strategy was to let your opponent believe they had one. While the leader spoke, threatening her life and demanding her cooperation, Sarah was quietly assessing her situation and planning her next move. The men had made several crucial mistakes. First, they had underestimated her fighting ability and assumed that disarming her would be enough to control her. Second, they were standing too close together, which would work against them if she could create enough chaos to break their formation. Third, and most importantly, they had no idea about her background in mixed martial arts and her specialized training in close-quarters combat. Sarah's father had been a Marine Corps drill instructor, and he had started teaching her self-defense techniques when she was still in elementary school. By the time she reached high school, she was competing in regional martial arts tournaments and had earned black belts in both karate and Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Her police training had built upon that foundation, teaching her how to adapt traditional martial arts techniques for real-world combat situations. The Riverside warehouse fires weren't accidents, the leader continued, his voice taking on a lecturing tone. My employer has significant investments in that area, and certain investigations have been causing problems for legitimate business operations. You've been asking the wrong people the wrong questions, Detective Martinez. Sarah listened carefully, not just to what he was saying, but to how he was saying it. His confidence was growing with each word, and she could see that he was beginning to relax slightly. The gun in his hand had dropped a few inches, no longer pointed directly at her head. The other men were also showing signs of decreased alertness, apparently convinced that the situation was under their control. Here's what's going to happen, the leader said. You're going to go back to your superiors and tell them that your investigation has reached a dead end. All the evidence points to electrical problems and insurance fraud by the previous tenants. Case closed. You're going to move on to other cases and forget that the Riverside District even exists. One of the men behind Sarah shifted his weight, and she could hear the soft rustle of his clothing. Her enhanced peripheral vision, honed by years of tactical training, allowed her to track the positions of all 5 men without moving her head. The man directly behind her was standing approximately 3 feet away, close enough for her to reach him in 2 quick steps. The man to her left was slightly farther away, but he was distracted, looking toward the garage entrance as if worried about potential witnesses. "And if someone else picks up the investigation?" Sarah asked, buying herself more time to prepare. The leader shrugged. "Then, they'll receive the same friendly warning you're getting tonight. Hopefully, they'll be smarter about accepting it." Sarah noticed that his gun hand had relaxed even further. The weapon was now pointed at her chest rather than her head, and his grip had loosened slightly. It was a small change, but, in a life-or-death situation, small advantages could make all the difference. She began to shift her weight imperceptibly, preparing for the explosive movement that would begin her counterattack. "What makes you think I'll cooperate?" Sarah asked. "I took an oath to serve and protect. I don't back down from investigations just because someone threatens me." The leader's expression hardened, and Sarah knew she had pushed him as far as she could. "Then, you're going to learn a very painful lesson about the real world, detective. Some fights aren't worth fighting." He raised his gun again, and Sarah knew that her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. She had perhaps 2 or 3 seconds before he decided to pull the trigger, and she needed to act before he could react to her movement. Everything she had learned over the years of training condensed into this single moment. Sarah exploded into motion with a speed and ferocity that caught all 5 men completely off guard. Her first target was the leader with the gun. She dropped into a low crouch and spun to her left, her right hand shooting out to grab his wrist while her left hand struck his forearm with a precise blow designed to disrupt his grip on the weapon. The gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as his finger reflexively squeezed the trigger. Before the leader could recover, Sarah continued her spin and drove her elbow into his solar plexus with tremendous force. The impact doubled him over and sent him staggering backward, gasping for air. His gun clattered to the floor, joining her service weapon in the growing collection of scattered firearms. The man directly behind Sarah reached for her, but she was already moving again. She pivoted on her left foot and delivered a devastating back kick to his midsection, using her momentum and the power of her leg muscles to drive all the air from his lungs. He folded around her foot like a piece of paper and collapsed to the ground, clutching his stomach and struggling to breathe. The remaining 3 men rushed her simultaneously, apparently thinking that their numerical advantage would overwhelm her. Sarah had been expecting this reaction, and she used their aggression against them. As the first man reached her, she grabbed his outstretched arm and used his own momentum to throw him over her shoulder in a classic judo throw. He sailed through the air and crashed into a concrete pillar with a sickening thud. The 4th man was smarter than his companions and tried to tackle her around the waist, hoping to bring her to the ground where his superior size and strength would give him an advantage. But Sarah had spent countless hours training in ground fighting techniques, and she was prepared for this type of attack. As he wrapped his arms around her waist, she drove her knee upward into his face with tremendous force. The impact broke his nose with a wet cracking sound, and blood immediately began streaming down his face. He released his grip and stumbled backward, his hands flying to his injured nose. Sarah didn't give him time to recover. She followed up with a quick combination of punches to his midsection and a final uppercut that sent him crashing to the ground. The 5th man had hesitated for a crucial moment, apparently shocked by the speed and efficiency with which Sarah had dispatched his companions. By the time he overcame his surprise and moved to attack her, she was ready for him. This man was the largest of the group, probably weighing at least 250 pounds, but Sarah had learned long ago that size wasn't everything in a fight. She waited for him to commit to his attack, then sidestepped at the last possible moment and grabbed his arm as he passed her. Using a technique called an arm drag, she pulled him forward and, off balance, then swept his legs out from under him. The big man hit the concrete floor hard, his head bouncing off the pavement with a sound like a dropped watermelon. The entire fight had lasted less than 90 seconds, but, to Sarah, it had seemed like an eternity. She stood in the center of the garage, breathing heavily and surveying the results of her handiwork. 5 men lay scattered around her like broken dolls, all of them either unconscious or too injured to continue fighting. The leader was slowly trying to get back to his feet, but he was still struggling to breathe normally after her elbow struck to his solar plexus. Sarah quickly moved to retrieve both her service weapon and the leader's gun, securing them before any of the men could recover enough to pose a further threat. Her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline coursing through her system, but her training kept her focused on the immediate priorities: secure the scene, assess the threats, and call for backup. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911, requesting immediate police and medical assistance. As she waited for help to arrive, she kept her weapon trained on the 5 men, watching carefully for any signs that they might attempt to continue their attack or try to escape. The leader finally managed to get enough air into his lungs to speak. "You have no idea what you've just done," he wheezed. "This is bigger than you think. You can't fight all of us." Sarah looked down at him with a mixture of contempt and professional satisfaction. "I just did," she replied calmly. "And, when my backup arrives, you're going to tell me everything about who sent you and what the Riverside case is really about." The sound of approaching sirens echoed through the parking garage as Sarah maintained her vigilant watch over the 5 injured men. The leader was now sitting up against a concrete pillar, still breathing heavily but no longer appearing to be in immediate medical distress. 2 of his companions remained unconscious, while the other 2 were conscious but clearly in significant pain from their injuries. Sarah's mind was racing as she processed what had just happened. This wasn't a random attack or even a simple case of criminal intimidation. The men had known her name, her schedule, and details about her active investigations. Someone with access to confidential police information was feeding intelligence to outside parties, and the implications of that betrayal were staggering. The first police cruiser arrived within minutes, followed quickly by an ambulance and additional backup units. Sarah recognized several of the responding officers, including Detective Mike Chen, her partner for the past 3 years. Mike's face showed a mixture of concern and amazement as he took in the scene: 5 men down, all apparently defeated by 1 woman in hand-to-hand combat. "Jesus, Sarah, what happened here?" Mike asked as he approached carefully, his weapon drawn but lowered. "5 men ambushed me in the garage," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "They knew my name and details about the Riverside investigation. They threatened me and tried to force me to drop the case." Mike's expression darkened as he realized the implications. "Internal leak?" "Has to be," Sarah confirmed. "These guys knew too much about departmental business for it to be anything else." The paramedics began treating the injured men while additional officers secured the scene and started collecting evidence. The leader, who had given his name as Viktor Petrov, was conscious and coherent enough to be questioned, but he wasn't talking. When Mike attempted to interrogate him, Petrov simply stared straight ahead and refused to respond to any questions. Detective Lieutenant Rodriguez arrived on the scene 20 minutes later, her face grim as she surveyed the aftermath of the confrontation. Maria Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran of the force and one of the most respected supervisors in the department. She had mentored Sarah during her early years as a detective and had always been a strong advocate for her career advancement. "Walk me through it," Rodriguez said, pulling Sarah aside for a private conversation. Sarah recounted the events in detail, from the moment she noticed the suspicious van to the final takedown of the 5th attacker. Rodriguez listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking for clarification about specific details. When Sarah finished her account, the lieutenant was quiet for several long moments. 5 men, Rodriguez finally said. "You took down 5 armed men by yourself." "They made mistakes," Sarah replied modestly. "They underestimated me and got overconfident. Plus, my father always said that surprise was worth more than superior numbers in a fight." Rodriguez smiled slightly at that. She knew about Sarah's background and training, but witnessing the results firsthand was still impressive. "What's your assessment of the security breach?" "Someone in the department is feeding information to outside parties," Sarah said bluntly. "The Riverside case files are supposed to be classified, but these men knew details that only a few people have access to." We need to start looking at everyone who's had contact with those files. Rodriguez nodded grimly. I'll start an internal investigation immediately. In the meantime, I'm putting you on administrative leave pending a full review of this incident. Sarah started to protest, but Rodriguez held up her hand. It's not punishment, Martinez. It's protection. If there's a leak in the department, then you're not safe here until we identify and neutralize the source. These people tried to kill you tonight. Next time, they might be better prepared. The thought of being sidelined while there was a corruption investigation underway was frustrating, but Sarah understood the reasoning. Her superior fighting skills had saved her life tonight, but she couldn't count on being that lucky again. Whoever was behind the Riverside cover-up had significant resources and wasn't afraid to use violence to protect their interests. Over the next few hours, the garage was thoroughly processed as a crime scene. The 5 attackers were transported to the hospital under police guard, and their weapons were collected as evidence. The white van that had been parked next to Sarah's car was found to contain surveillance equipment and photographs of Sarah taken over the past several weeks. Someone had been watching her for a long time, studying her routine and preparing for this encounter. Detective Chen pulled Sarah aside as the scene was being wrapped up. I've been thinking about the timing of this attack, he said quietly. You've been working on the Riverside case for 3 months, but they waited until tonight to make their move. What's changed recently? Sarah considered the question carefully. I submitted a request for additional forensic analysis of the warehouse debris yesterday morning. The lab was supposed to start processing the samples today. What kind of analysis? Chemical residue testing. I wanted to see if there were any traces of accelerants that might have been missed in the initial investigation. If the fires were deliberately set, there should be microscopic evidence in the debris. Mike's expression became thoughtful. So if someone wanted to prevent that analysis from happening, they would need to either steal the evidence or neutralize the investigating officer. Exactly. And, since the evidence is locked up in a secure facility, it would be easier to go after me. The implications of this realization were disturbing. Sarah's investigation had been getting close to uncovering something that someone was willing to kill to protect. The warehouse fires in the Riverside district had claimed 3 lives and caused millions of dollars in property damage. If they were deliberately set as part of some larger criminal conspiracy, then the stakes were much higher than a simple insurance fraud case. As Sarah finally left the garage and headed home in a different vehicle, her mind was already working on the next phase of her investigation. Being placed on administrative leave would actually give her more freedom to pursue certain lines of inquiry that would have been difficult to follow while maintaining her official duties. Sometimes the best way to catch a corrupt cop was to operate outside the normal channels. She made a mental note to contact some of her sources in the private investigation community. There were retired cops and former federal agents who specialized in corporate security and white-collar crime. If the Riverside case involved business interests with enough money and power to corrupt police officers and hire professional assassins, then it would require resources and expertise beyond what the local police department could provide. Sarah also realized that she would need to be extremely careful about her personal security from this point forward. The attack in the garage had failed, but whoever was behind it would likely try again. Next time, they would be better prepared and would have learned from their mistakes. She would need to vary her routine, change her living arrangements, and possibly even acquire some additional protection. As she drove through the empty streets toward her apartment, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every pair of headlights in her rearview mirror could belong to another team of assassins. Every shadow could conceal a sniper. The paranoia was probably excessive, but after what had happened tonight, a healthy dose of paranoia might be the only thing that kept her alive. The next morning, Sarah woke up to find that news of the garage fight had leaked to the media. The local newspaper's headline read, "Detective fights off 5 attackers in downtown garage." The article was light on details, but it was enough to confirm that word was spreading about the incident. Sarah knew that this media attention would complicate her unofficial investigation, but it might also provide some protection by making her a public figure. Her phone began ringing almost immediately with calls from reporters, but Sarah ignored them all. She had more important things to do than give interviews. The chemical analysis results from the warehouse debris were scheduled to be completed today, and she wanted to see those results before anyone had a chance to tamper with them or make them disappear. 3 weeks after the garage confrontation, Sarah sat in a cramped surveillance van parked across the street from the Riverside Forensic Laboratory. Despite being officially on administrative leave, she had continued her investigation through unofficial channels, and the results had been far more shocking than she had initially anticipated. The chemical analysis of the warehouse debris had indeed revealed traces of military-grade thermite, confirming her suspicions that the fires had been deliberately set. But that was only the beginning of what she had uncovered. Working with Marcus Webb, a former FBI agent turned private investigator, Sarah had discovered that the warehouse fires were part of a much larger real estate development scheme involving city officials, construction companies, and organized crime figures. The fires had been set to clear out low-income tenants and small businesses so that the property could be redeveloped into luxury condominiums. The corruption reached deep into the police department itself. Captain Harold Morrison, who supervised the arson investigation unit, had been receiving regular payments from Apex Development Corporation in exchange for ensuring that the warehouse fires were classified as accidents rather than arson. The 5 men who had attacked Sarah in the garage were hired muscle brought in from Eastern Europe by Morrison when he learned that Sarah's investigation was getting too close to the truth. Viktor Petrov, the leader of the attack team, had finally started talking after his lawyer advised him that cooperation might reduce his sentence. Through him, Sarah had learned that Morrison had initially planned to have her transferred to a different unit, but when that proved impossible due to her reputation and connections within the department, he had decided that more direct action was necessary. The surveillance operation Sarah was conducting today was designed to gather the final pieces of evidence needed to expose the entire conspiracy. Morrison was scheduled to meet with representatives from Apex Development at a warehouse in the industrial district, and Sarah planned to record their conversation using high-tech equipment provided by Webb's private investigation firm. Target vehicle approaching from the east, Webb's voice crackled through Sarah's earpiece. He was positioned on a rooftop 2 blocks away with a camera equipped with a telephoto lens. Black BMW sedan, license plate matches Morrison's personal vehicle. Sarah adjusted her recording equipment and checked her backup weapon, a small pistol that Webb had helped her obtain through private channels. After the garage incident, she had decided that she would never again allow herself to be caught without adequate protection. The weapon was concealed in a shoulder holster beneath her jacket, easily accessible but invisible to casual observation. Morrison's BMW pulled into the warehouse parking lot and stopped near a loading dock where 2 other vehicles were already waiting. Sarah recognized one of them as belonging to Thomas Brennan, the president of Apex Development. The other was a white panel truck that probably belonged to the construction crew that would be handling the demolition and rebuilding work. Through her binoculars, Sarah watched as Morrison got out of his car and walked toward the warehouse entrance. He was a large man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of wielding authority within the police department. Sarah had worked under his command for 2 years before transferring to Rodriguez's unit, and she had always found him to be demanding but fair. Learning about his involvement in the conspiracy had been a personal betrayal as well as a professional shock. Brennan emerged from the warehouse to greet Morrison, and the 2 men shook hands before disappearing inside the building. Sarah waited for several minutes to ensure that they were settled into their meeting before beginning her approach. The warehouse was surrounded by a chain-link fence, but Webb had identified several gaps in the security that would allow her to get close enough to record their conversation. Sarah slipped out of the van and made her way carefully across the street, using parked cars and shipping containers for cover. The industrial district was largely deserted at this time of day, which made her approach easier but also meant that she would be highly visible if anyone happened to look in her direction. She reached the fence without incident and found the gap that Webb had identified in his preliminary reconnaissance. The warehouse itself was a typical industrial building with corrugated metal siding and small windows set high in the walls. Sarah could see light coming from one of the windows on the side facing the parking lot, and she could hear the faint sound of voices from inside. She activated her recording device and began working her way closer to the building, staying low and moving carefully to avoid making any noise that might alert the occupants. As she reached a position beneath the lighted window, Sarah could finally make out individual words from the conversation inside. Morrison was speaking, and his voice carried the tone of someone who was growing increasingly nervous about his situation. "The Martinez problem has gotten out of hand," Morrison was saying. "She took out 5 trained men and survived an attempt on her life. Now she's got media attention and support from the upper levels of the department. We can't touch her without raising too many questions." Brennan's voice was calmer but carried an undertone of menace. "Then, we'll have to find another way to deal with her. My investors are not going to be happy if this project gets delayed because of one overzealous detective." "What do you suggest?" Morrison asked. "She's on administrative leave, but that's only temporary. Eventually, she'll be back on active duty, and she'll continue pushing for answers about the warehouse fires." "There are always ways to handle troublesome individuals," Brennan replied. "We just need to be more creative about our approach." "What about her personal life? Family members? Close friends?" Sarah felt her blood run cold as she realized they were discussing targeting innocent people as a way to get to her. She had known that her investigation was dangerous, but the thought that her family and friends might become targets added a new dimension of urgency to her mission. "Her father lives in Phoenix," Morrison said, and Sarah could hear the reluctance in his voice. "Retired Marine. Her mother died several years ago. She has a sister who teaches elementary school in Denver." "Perfect," Brennan said with satisfaction. Sometimes the most effective way to neutralize a threat is to give them something more important to worry about than their professional duties. Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her concealed weapon as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. These men were calmly discussing plans to threaten or harm her family members as a way to force her to drop her investigation. The casual nature of their conversation made it clear that this wasn't the first time they had used such tactics. A third voice joined the conversation, one that Sarah didn't immediately recognize. "The Eastern European contractors have been compromised," the new voice said. "Petrov is cooperating with federal investigators, and the other 4 are likely to follow suit once they realize how much trouble they're in." "How much does Petrov know?" Brennan asked. "Too much," the third man replied. "He can connect Morrison to the payments from Apex, and he has details about the other fires we've set over the past 2 years. If he talks, this entire operation could collapse." Sarah realized that the scope of the conspiracy was even larger than she had imagined. The Riverside warehouse fires weren't an isolated incident but part of a systematic campaign of arson designed to clear out undesirable tenants and businesses throughout the city. The corruption and violence she had uncovered represented just the tip of a much larger criminal enterprise. "Then, we need to accelerate our timeline," Brendan said. "How many properties do we still need to clear?" 3 warehouse complexes in the Riverside district and 2 apartment buildings in the Eastside neighborhood, Morrison replied. "But, with all the attention on the arson cases right now, it's going to be difficult to make them look like accidents." "Then, we won't bother trying to make them look like accidents," Brennan said coldly. "We'll make them look like gang violence or terrorist attacks. Something that will generate fear rather than investigation." Sarah had heard enough. She carefully backed away from the window and began making her way back toward the fence, moving as quietly as possible to avoid detection. The recording device had captured everything they had said, providing clear evidence of the conspiracy and their plans for future attacks. But she also knew that she was now in more danger than ever before. As she reached the gap in the fence, Sarah heard footsteps behind her. She spun around to see Morrison emerging from the warehouse, apparently heading back to his car. Their eyes met across the parking lot, and Sarah saw the shock of recognition followed immediately by cold calculation. Morrison's hand moved toward his service weapon as he began walking in her direction. Sarah didn't wait to see what he intended to do. She sprinted toward the van where Webb was waiting, her heart pounding as she heard Morrison shouting behind her. The sound of his footsteps on the pavement told her that he was in pursuit, and she knew that her only chance of survival was to reach the van before he could get a clear shot at her. The van's engine roared to life as Webb saw her approaching, and Sarah dove through the passenger door just as Morrison rounded the corner of a nearby building. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them as Webb floored the accelerator, but the shots went wide as the van sped away from the warehouse complex. "Did you get it?" Webb asked as they raced through the industrial district toward safety. "Every word," Sarah replied, holding up the recording device. "And it's worse than we thought. Much worse." As they drove toward the federal building where Sarah would turn over her evidence to FBI investigators, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. What had started as a routine arson investigation had uncovered a web of corruption that reached deep into the heart of the city government and law enforcement community. The fight in the parking garage had been just the beginning of a much larger battle for justice and truth. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a federal courtroom and watched as Morrison, Brennan, and 14 other conspirators were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The Apex Development Corporation was dissolved, and its assets were seized to compensate the victims of the arson attacks. The warehouse fires investigation became a landmark case in the fight against police corruption and organized crime. Sarah was eventually promoted to detective sergeant and assigned to head a new anti-corruption unit within the police department. She never forgot the lesson she had learned in that parking garage. Sometimes the only way to fight corruption and violence is to stand up and fight back, regardless of the odds. The recording device that had captured the conspiracy was displayed in her office as a reminder that truth and justice were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win.